damage to the muscles, causes stress to the cardiovascular system, and then the natural response of the body is, okay, I got to make myself stronger, so if I do get into a bout of exercise that is overloading in the future, I'll be better able to prepare for it. So if you want to get stronger, you have to work at an intensity that is higher than what you normally do. In regards to variation, we typically want to make it so that our athletes are not doing the same thing every day, so that they don't have unnecessary tissue breakdown, boredom, all sorts of other things. So what we do is we vary, or we go through a principle called periodization, where we have the entire year broken down into subsections, either macro cycles or mesocycles or microcycles. A macro cycle is like a big, huge, gigantic like calendar, like section of the calendar. And within that section of the calendar, my macro cycle is 1 year long. But it could be the case that some sports have 2 different seasons, so their macro cycle might be 2 6-month seasons. For gymnastics, it's a 1 year macro cycle. And within that macro cycle, we break everything down into 6-week sections called mesocycles. And within those mesocycles, we also have breakdowns even further into 2-week microcycles. And within each of those time periods, we introduce different things like plyometric training, like muscle endurance training, muscle maintenance, all sorts of different exercising strategies are introduced throughout the season, so that we make sure that we achieve different exercise goals. When you're in one section of the season and you're, say, for instance, working hypertrophy gains, you don't necessarily want to work strength and power gains. When you're doing muscle endurance towards the end of the season so that they get better and better at staying on the event and doing routines, you don't want to focus on plyometrics at that point, because plyometrics on top of routines is going to cause tissue breakdown. So what we try to do is we manipulate volume and intensity of exercises throughout the year to make sure that we have, we're able to achieve different training goals. Right now we are on slide 16. Some of the goals of one season are going to be different than the other. In my off season, immediately after the national championships, I want my athletes to have 4 weeks of active rest. And then once that active rest ends and we're in our true off season, then what I want them to do is work on hypertrophy, making their muscles bigger. And once their muscles are bigger, then what we can do is we can work bigger muscles into strength and power. And then once we get into like the beginning of the season, we're going to stop getting stronger and more powerful, maintain whatever strength and power we have, and then hopefully we'll be able to work better routines and muscle endurance and things like that later on. So in regards to, one second. Man, I wish I could pause. All right, I'll just rip it through. So when we do strength, hypertrophy, and power training, we do both focus on concentric and eccentric muscle contractions. Now, concentric and eccentric muscle contractions are very different. Concentric muscle contractions generate power. They're usually when the athlete is, sorry, one second. They're usually when the athlete is pulling the weight against the pull of gravity. And if your muscles are shortening and you're pulling the weight against gravity, like during a bicep curl, then your muscles actually have to overcome the grip of gravity pulling the weight down, generating power. An eccentric muscle contraction is the opposite. As the weight is lowering down, your muscles are elongating and firing so that they can try to absorb the pull of gravity. So your body works as, your muscles work as the gas pedal, but they also work as the brake. So when you do strength, hypertrophy, and power training, you do not want to only do concentric strength. You want to make sure that you focus on eccentric muscle contractions, so that your body does have the opportunity and ability to generate but also absorb power. And if your body is only able to generate power and cannot absorb power, then what happens is you don't have the ability to absorb extra force that's carrying through the system, and that's going to lead tissues to potential damage and things like that. So there's also some suggestions that a good amount of the muscle hypertrophy, and if there is any hyperplasia at all, which is the increase in number of muscle fibers, that it happens because of eccentric muscle contraction. There's also some evidence to show that rather than actual static flexibility increasing muscle length, could be the eccentric muscle contraction that has a lot to do with that. So, especially in a sport like gymnastics, gymnastics is all about absorbing forces, landings, and smashing into the horse. And in fact, I think that a lot of gymnastics is eccentric muscle contraction as compared to concentric muscle contraction. So we really focus on good negatives, which means we do our concentric contractions as fast as we can, and we do our negative contractions as slow as we can, with the intent of manipulating the force velocity curve and increasing eccentric muscle contraction at low and high velocities. They're already good at high velocity contractions, eccentric is. And we're also trying to increase the potential for concentric contractions at high velocities. So we're trying to manipulate the strength, the force velocity curve to increase overall strength. The order of the exercise selection that we choose is very important. You want to make sure that you start with large muscle group exercises first, and then you can work towards fine-tuning things. So if you're going to do things like squats, you're going to do squats and squats, leg presses, and things like that at the very beginning of the exercise. And at the end of the exercise, you'll do more fine-tuning things with wrists and YTLs and things like that, bungee shoulder exercises. So work on large muscle groups and high intensity, and then work your way to smaller muscle groups and lower intensity. Regarding rest periods, it depends on the experience of the athlete, and it also depends on what you're trying to accomplish. People who are lifting for the first time should have, at least the book suggests, 2 to 3 minutes between sets, and other individuals who are more advanced can have varying time between sets, depending upon whether or not they're trying to improve strength, increase metabolic demands, and things like that. So rest period and exercise order become relatively important criteria when you're organizing and designing your strength and conditioning programs. There's different types of resistance programs. Static contraction would be resistance with isometric contractions. So like a chin up and hold, or like planks where I'm not changing my angle of orientation in my joints at all. Those would be all static isometric contraction resistance exercises. There is evidence that shows that there's potential benefit to doing that, but there's still research needed to be done. But these things are good for rehabilitation situations where people have to keep their limbs immobile. So let's say somebody has, I don't know, I can't speak to this 100%, but let's say somebody has just had an ACL injury or something, and they want to keep the hypertrophy, or they want to reduce atrophy of the quadriceps without changing the angle of orientation of their knee joint. Perhaps they could do some isometric strength training exercises prior to dynamic strength rehab for that particular injury. In regards to ACSM guidelines, I added a slide. It's slide 18, and it talks just about the American College Sports Medicine guidelines for strength development, muscle hypertrophy, development of muscle power, and increased muscle endurance. For the novice, it's suggested that in order to increase strength, 60 to 70% of the 1RM is used. They do 1 to 3 sets, 8 to 12 reps, slow to moderate velocity, and they do that 2 to 3 times per week. In regards to the frequency, an individual who is a novice should only be doing resistance training 2 to 3 times a week. An individual who's at the intermediate training level should only do resistance training 3 to 4 times a week, and an advanced individual or trainer could do strength training 4 to 6 times per week. The suggestion for an individual who is at an advanced training level in order to increase strength development is that they work between 80 to 100% of their 1RM max. In regards to muscle hypertrophy, the novice should be working at 70 to 85% of their 1 RM max. If they're not working between 70 to 85% of the 1 RM max, it could be the case that the body or the intensity of the exercise isn't enough. And if the intensity or the stress isn't enough, there's not going to be the micro damage to the muscles. The brain's not going to send the endocrine system isn't going to release testosterone or growth factor as effectively, and because of that, other changes will occur. And if changes that and if the changes are not strength and power and increase in protein synthesis, then the changes that will occur are going to be more along the lines to increase oxygenation and the metabolic processes. So if you're doing and trying to do muscle hypertrophy training and the intensity isn't high enough, then you're never going to get your muscles bigger. All right. If you're doing dips and you're doing 10, 12, 15, 25 dips in a row and you're getting stronger, and your coach says, okay, if you want to get even stronger, then do 3 sets of 40. Well, that's not going to work, because if you're doing 40 dips, the intensity of the dips isn't there. So there's not going to be a release of testosterone or growth factor from the endocrine system. There's not going to be protein synthesis like that, and all of that hypertrophy training is actually going into muscle endurance training. So when you do muscle hypertrophy, an advanced training athlete wants to work about 70 to 100% of their 1 RM max. According to the ACSM guidelines, you want to do about 8 to 10 different exercises with 3 sets of the exercises. And in regards to muscle hypertrophy training, it doesn't really necessarily matter the speed at which you do the activity. It's more the intensity of the weights that you're lifting. In terms of muscle power, a novice should be working about 2 to 3 times per week. They should be doing 1 to 3 sets, 3 to 8 reps, and they should be focusing on moderate speed. As the training efficiency and the experience of your athlete increases to the intermediate and advanced level, they can start to incorporate as much speed as they can so that they can manipulate the force times velocity side of that power equation. So right now in the gym, I think that a lot of our athletes, they cannot keep up with the metabolic or the nutritional component of the strength and conditioning program. And I have nothing that I can do to control that. Like when they're at home, I can't control what they're eating. I can't control what they're eating at the gym, what they're eating at school. So like I can provide the strength and conditioning program, but I can't regulate the whole other side, the nutrition part of it. So for me, I'm thinking that maybe doing all of this kettlebell and barbell and underhand row and all of that stuff with the guys in the gym, maybe what we should do is things like just speed training, ladders and things like that. And if I'm not trying to increase muscle size and muscle speed and protein growth and this and that, maybe the metabolic demand is going to drop. And if the metabolic demand drops, then I'm addressing the fact that they can't keep up with the nutrition, but they're still going to get powerful. So over the next 6 weeks in this new mesocycle that I have, what I'm going to try to do is really focus on things like those med ball speed exercises, 5 to 10 seconds of med ball work, and see if I can get those things faster and faster and faster, as opposed to focusing on farmer carries, overhead press, and all these typical strength and force manipulations of the power perspective. So for class, I'll bring in, I have another slide 19 is my actual periodization chart. And I'll explain it very quickly here so that you guys can see. All the way to the left, you'll see there's an orange strip here, and that's between June. That's an active rest, a 4-week active rest. And then we go into the first of our 2 mesocycles that say off season. So the off season is from June to the end of August. And then there's 2 6-week cycles where what we're trying to do is focus on hypertrophy. And you'll notice at the bottom of the hypertrophy, it says that we're working between 7 to 12 in our volume. So I want them to be able to do 7 to 12 reps, and I'll show you where I get this information. So at the beginning of my off season, my athletes start to do sets of our exercise. We have an incredible strength and conditioning program that has 4 different days of activity. Our guys are highly trained. You can see under frequency and days, it says 4, 5, 6, 4, 5, 6, 4, 5, 6. Our athletes are going to be doing strength and conditioning about 4 or 5 days per week. You can see that it says the percentage of the 1 RM max in order to increase hypertrophy gains starts with a small taper at 65 to increase all the way to 80%. And so this is our manipulation of hypertrophy. I can explain it a little bit easier in class because you'll see it. And then what we do is in the preseason, we break into our strength and power. And you'll see again, those are 2 6-week blocks that last from September to the end of November. And you can also see within that, I have SP, strength, power, strength, power, strength, power. Those strength power are 2-week intervals. So those would be our microcycles within the mesocycle. And in those 2-week intervals, what we do is focus on strength for 2 weeks, focus on power, focus on strength and power, and strength and power. And then at the end of the preseason, when we get to our beginning 12 weeks of in-season, it says maintenance. At the end of our preseason, I'm not expecting our guys to put on any more weight. I'm not expecting our guys to put on any more muscle mass or improve appreciably in strength and power. At this stage of the game, I'm really focused on muscle maintenance. You can see that the number of times that they're going to be focusing on strength and power goes from 6 and 5 and 4 days down to 3 and 4 days. So our guys are now doing this maintenance cycle for 3 and 4 days. Actually, right now, we're in the middle of our at the middle of our preseason. So we're focusing right now, again, on 6 more weeks of strength and power. And then at the end of November, we should be starting this muscle maintenance program where you can see that now the reps go from 7 to 12 to 8 to 10 reps. And they're there 3 days per week. And we're just going to do 8 to 10 reps. We're not going to increase, decrease. We're not going to do any progressive overload or anything like that. I just want them to maintain the strength, power, and hypertrophy that they gained during the off season and the preseason. We're going to do 6 weeks of that maintenance, followed by another 6 weeks of maintenance. And then you'll see at about midway through February, as our season really starts to kind of like progress, we're going to switch to muscle endurance. You see that we switch from 4 and 3 days per week to 3 and 2 days per week doing muscle endurance. And with muscle endurance, the reps increases to 12 to 15. So again, a pretty big decrease in my intensity so that the muscle protein synthesis isn't necessarily going to be triggered. And what's going to happen instead is increase in vascularization and an increase in all of the properties of the type 1 muscle fiber types that are going to burn and utilize oxygen effectively so that they have enough energy to finish long bouts of routines. Slide 20 is another added slide. It's the American College of Sports Medicine Resistance Training Guide. It's available on Google if you take a look at it. It shows where certain training goals should occur to achieve those particular results. So if you're trying to train for strength, you should do enough intensity so that you can only do between 2 and 6 reps. So if you're able to do 10, 12, 13 reps of something, then it's going to not be enough intensity to increase strength, but rather it's going to be the right intensity to increase muscle size. If you want to increase power, you have to work between 2 to 5 reps, increase the weights even more, and then you want to really make sure that you're distributing those weights very quickly. So for strength and power, you're going to be doing like 3 sets of 3 as opposed to 3 sets of 10. And that's going to mean that the intensity of the lift that you're going to do is very high. And because of that, you have to balance that out with the correct amount of rest in between your sets. So for strength and power, we usually do a 1 to 3 strength to rest ratio. For hypertrophy, it can be a little bit different because you really want to stress the system there. So for hypertrophy training, you want to do things between 7 to 12 reps. So if I can do 12 dips and I want to try to get my muscles stronger, then instead of doing 15 and 20 dips, what I should do is increase weight, maybe put on a little weight vest or an ankle weight so that the ankle weight adds intensity. So when I do the dips, I can only do 7 dips again. Then I keep doing my 7 dips. Eventually I can do 8 dips without weight on. Eventually I can do 9 with the weight on. And eventually when I get to be able to do another 10 dips without weight on, increase the weight again so I can only do 7. And then I keep going, and that's going to make my muscles bigger. When I do muscle endurance, it says that you can do, anywhere between 13 to 20 reps. So if I'm doing 35, 40 dips or 25, 35 push-ups, and I'm trying to get stronger, I'm trying to get my muscles bigger, sometimes people will ask me for advice. How do I get bigger? I've been doing lots of push-ups and this and that. Usually say to them, well, I mean, lots of push-ups means that the intensity isn't high enough. So for the most part, you're going to be focusing on muscular endurance. Um, Slide 21 is another slide that I included from a different book. It's a reiteration of the American College of Sports Medicine load and repetition assignments based on what your training goal is. So to narrow it down, if you're working on strength, you should be working at 85% or more of your 1RM, and you should be focusing for less than 6 reps per set. If you're working on power and you're doing like a single effort event, then like gymnastics is, they should be working between 80 to 90% of their 1RM max, and they should try to get maybe 1 or 2 repetitions. And they'd want to try to get those 1 or 2 repetitions out as fast as possible. If you're working on muscle hypertrophy, you should be working between